what I love, I happen to love old people. Now, I truly, sincerely mean that. I love old people. My grandmother, yes, I know, I love you too so much. My grandmother is one of my best friends, okay? My grandma happens to be, her and I have the most unique, incredible relationship. She was in town 2 weeks ago, and she looked at me and she said, "I don't like your new haircut." And I said, "Well, I don't like the perm you've had the past 100 years. And she said, "Well, I love you." And I said, "Well, I still love you." And I said, "Are we still best friends?" She said, "Yeah," and gave me a knuckles. I mean, that's just my grandma. I just love her, but I love old people in general. And I'm not disrespectful like that. That's just stating facts. I love them. If you're double my age, I consider you an old person, and I love you. And I'm so glad that you're part of our church. A couple of things that I love about elderly people is, one, they're most of the time conservative politically, which I love that about them. They're conservative, they are down home, they are those type of people, and I love talking with them about that. I love that they share their mind and they have nothing to lose. It's like, well, I'll tell you if I don't like your haircut. I'll tell you if I didn't like that message. I'll tell you if I didn't care for that. And we're always still friends afterwards. We just get along great. I love that, generally speaking, they're incredibly grateful people because they've actually had to work for something in their life. They like worked really, really hard. And my grandpa would say, "Man, I worked 3 jobs, made it through World War II, saw a depression, and I am grateful." And you don't know grateful. But I mean, he was just a good-hearted, hard-working man. And my neighbor, her name's Brenda, she's quickly becoming one of my best friends. She's 72 years old. She's a widow. And her and I have a great time just kind of going back and forth. And I go over to her house. I help mow her yard. I change her light bulbs for her. We sit on her porch and talk about the sweet nothings of life and everything else. And Brenda asked me, she said one time, she said, "Hey, would you mind helping me hang some pictures in my home?" I said, "Absolutely, I'm in." I said, "Now, I am a little busy right now, so let me call you when I have some time." I went home that afternoon. I felt like the Lord really challenged my heart of, get over there and help Brenda hang some pictures. So I called her. I said, "Hey, Brenda." She said, "Yeah." I said, "Hey, I'll be over after 7 when I put my kids to bed." And she's like, "Oh, wonderful." So I showed up about 7:15, and she opened up the door, and she was dressed up. She was ready. Like, this was exciting to her. She had some old Sinatra playing, and she had just made a patty melt and some tomato basil soup, and she was kind of she had this light fluffiness about her walking through her home. She was so excited that I was there to help her hang these pictures. And so there were boxes, by the way, of hundreds of pictures. I thought she meant like, "Hey, hang these 3 in my entryway and we'll be great." Like, she had boxes lining her walls. And so we would go over to this box, and she'd pull out this picture, and then she'd say, "Oh, this was Christmas 1988 when we were living in Colorado, and that's my husband, and those are my kids, and those are my grandkids." And she was just walking me through her life. And then she would look at the wall and she would say, "Let's put that one, ooh, that's right there's a good spot." And then I'd pull out another picture, and I saw this picture, and and she began telling me, "I did it again. I worshiped my way out of saliva," which I'm super grateful for. She did it again. She would look at the picture and she said, "Oh, that's from when we lived in Kansas. And that was when my kids had just had a snowball fight, and my husband was upset with them, and I was just making food." And she began to tell me, let's put that one over there because it leads into this story." And she pulled out a picture, and I quickly realized she didn't want pictures hung up on her wall. She wanted to bring life into her house again. She wanted to be able to look out and see the story of her life, see the things that she had prayed for, see the things that she had trusted God for, see the blessings in her life. And it was so much more. Now the excitement that she had, I can look back on it and see, no wonder she was dressed up. No wonder she had Sinatra playing. No wonder she made her favorite meal. No wonder she had lined the pictures out, because it wasn't just hanging pictures. It was seeing the fulfillment of the life that she had lived and experiencing it when she walked through the walls of her house. She told me, "Now this feels like home." Before, it just felt like empty walls. When we're seeking the fulfillment that God has for us, it is more than just figuring out how to go through life. It is figuring out exactly what he has promised us and then pursuing that promise until we see the fulfillment of it. A guy who did this bad and then very well is a man named Abraham. We talked about him the first week, so I figured we'd just stick with him. Abraham was a man in pursuit of the fulfillment of a covenant that God had given him. And we pick up in Genesis 15, 1 through 15. It says, sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you and your reward will be great. But Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you have given me no children, Eleazar of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You've given me no descendants of my own, so one of my descendants will be my heir. Then the Lord said to him, no, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir. Then the Lord took Abraham outside and said to him, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Then the Lord told him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans and to give you this land of your possession. But Abraham replied, O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that I will actually possess it? Verse 9. Then the Lord told him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So Abraham presented all these to him and killed them. Then he cut each animal down the middle and laid the halves side by side. He did not, however, cut the birds in half. Some vultures swooped down to eat the carcasses, but Abraham chased them away. Verse 12, as the sun was going down, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a terrifying darkness came down over him. Then the Lord said to Abram, you can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. Verse 14, but I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end they will come away with great wealth. The book of Exodus in 2 verses. Verse 15, as for you, you will die in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 was given a promise from God. You will inherit a land, you will become a great nation. I will bless those who bless you, I will curse those who curse you. I will make your descendants so vast you can't even count them. Yet in Genesis chapter 15, the Lord asks Abraham to do something, and Abraham says to him, I'm not seeing the fulfillment of what you've promised me, so how do I continue to pursue you when I'm not seeing it in my natural life? In other words, I am believing God for something right now, and He's challenged me to be obedient and to be faithful, but I'm not seeing the fruit of it. I've asked Him for a job, and I'm not seeing that job come up, but He's called me to be faithful to whatever it is I've committed to. How do I continue to pursue you, to see the fulfillment of what you've promised me when it's not manifesting itself in my natural life? There are 4 things with Abraham. One more swig, I'll drink to that. There are 4 things with Abraham that we see in this story that give us a clear picture of how to pursue the fulfillment that God has promised us. The first one is in Genesis 15, 1 through 3. It said, we just read it, sometime later the Lord spoke to Abraham in a vision and said to him, do not be afraid, Abraham, for I will protect you and your reward will be great. Catch what Abraham says here. Verse 2, but Abraham replied, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? A key to pursuing what God has promised you and staying obedient when you haven't seen it yet is to not get tunnel vision in your lack. Don't get tunnel vision in what He is not giving you that you want Him to give you, and stay open to everything else that He is doing around you and the work that He is making happen near you. In other words, I grew up in Kansas City. I told you that. There was a place called the Plaza in Kansas City. It was where every high schooler took their first date. You took them to the Plaza. And at the Plaza, they had these carriage rides that went around. And if you were a really big baller, you went to dinner and then you reserved a carriage ride for the evening. And you would get in these carriage rides and you'd hope for cold weather so you could, keep her warm and, safe and protected. And you would ride in these carriage rides around the plaza, and generally what would happen would be a relationship would take off or a quick ending to the night, because a dinner and a carriage ride and a mariachi band doesn't exactly scream sanity on the first date. But guys did it all the time. They put it all together. And these carriage rides would go, and I would watch these horses go through traffic. They would go through lines of people. They would go through these crowds, and I always wondered how they did it. And then I got up close to one of them one time, and I realized something. They had these giant blinders on each side of their head. They had these blinders that only allowed them to focus on what was directly ahead of them. So what was going on around them, they couldn't even see. Sometimes the thing that we are believing God for the most can become a blinder to everything else that He is doing around us. We can become so consumed with, I want this blessing. I want this. I'm believing God for this. I am hoping for this. 8 years I wanted to plant a church. I was a student pastor for 5 of those. The whole time I wanted to plant a church, I started getting into this place where it's like, I want to plant a church. I want to plant a church. All I think about is planting a church. All I read about is planting a church. All I'm consumed with is planting a church. And it got to a point where my desire of God to bless that big picture began to pull me away from focusing on what He has immediately placed in front of me. Sometimes the blessing can become a blinder to everything else that is happening. We just had a crazy storm that happened. And we can look back at that and we can see God's protection and God's grace, or we can be so wrapped up with, well, I wanted this car, I wanted this house, I wanted this, and I'm upset it didn't happen. Take a second and look at what the Lord has protected you from. Look at what He has brought to you. Look at how He has blessed you and how He has cared for you. And when you begin to see what He is doing around you, you will begin to pursue faithfulness regardless of circumstance. And we have to understand this. The greatest opportunity for growth in our faith is before we have received what we're believing God for. It's before. That's the greatest opportunity for growth, because when we receive it, faith is no longer in play. Because faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. So what you don't see but you're believing God for is actually a time of faith. Once you receive it and you have it in front of you, you no longer are in faith. So if you are in here today and you are believing God for something that you have yet to receive, you can praise and you can rejoice, because you are right in a prime opportunity for your faith to grow. Don't get tunnel vision in what God is not doing, and stay focused on everything He is doing around you. The Lord tells Abraham, hey, I'm going to reward you and make you great. And Abraham said, what good will that be if you don't give me the one thing that I want? And the Lord instantly said, that's coming, but I need you to be faithful now. I need you to follow me now. I need you to do what I've called you right now. The second thing with Abraham is, this is unique, what the Lord calls him to do. It says in verse 15, 4-5, then the Lord said to Abraham, no, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir. Then the Lord took Abraham outside and said to him, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. You have to understand, the Lord called Abraham out of a circle of limitation into a place where he could see the limitless capability of God. He said, Abraham, for 1 second, step out of your circle of limitation. Your life that you're in, where I don't see it happening here, I don't see it happening there, my wife's not pregnant, I don't have the child that I want, and step out for a second and count the stars if you can. Expand your faith a little bit. Open your eyes and realize that what is happening right here is just a fraction of what God is capable of doing. I have a real personal experience with this verse. We were at a place a couple of years ago as a family where we were believing God for healing. We were believing Him to just step into a situation that was a challenge for us as a family, and we weren't seeing it at all. It was not happening. It wasn't there. and I was getting frustrated. I was in this circle of limitation where I'm just thinking, oh, I don't see it, so it must not be happening. Something must not be occurring here. So I read this verse actually that morning in our devotional time. I read that verse, and then in the evenings, I run in the evenings. It's just a great way for me to blow off some steam and chill out. So in the evenings, I throw on some headphones, I listen to worship music, and I take off on a run. I was running that evening, ran around a little bit, came home, and in the evenings after I've done the running, I go out to my patio to cool off, and I sat down, and just about that time, and that whole time I was just frustrated. I was just believing God for something I wasn't seeing. I sat down in my patio chair, and I looked up, and it was crazy because you generally never see them, but in our neighborhood, you could look up and you could see stars. And I remember reading this morning, and I just thought to myself, you know what? Let's try it. Let's give it a shot. And I looked up, and just out of frustration, I started thinking, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then it got to a point where it's like, have I already counted that one? I think they've moved on me. Like, I don't know what is going on right now. But it just kind of got to a point where it was so overwhelming, and it was so much more than what I was capable of thinking. And I thought, you know what, Lord? I get it. I understand what you're saying. That sometimes the limitations of my situation are not a direct representation of what you are doing, but you are greater than my situation. You are much larger than what I can see. You are doing far more in the supernatural than I can see in the natural, and I'm going to trust you because I can't outcount you. I can't outnumber. If you're believing God for something, sometimes you just got to step out of our circle of limitation and go count a few stars. Go remind yourself that God is so much bigger than what you're not seeing happen right now. Remind yourself that He has far greater plans for you than what you are able to comprehend, and be willing to walk in faith when you can't see it because you can't count Him. The Lord said, Abraham, you want to know how you'll know? Step outside and do a little counting. See if you're that much bigger than I am. See if you're that much smarter than I am. See if you can comprehend more than I can. Or just realize that I'm working in the midst of it. And then Abraham's response, I love his response, Genesis 15:6. It is so simple yet profound. It says, and Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Abraham believed God. Abraham counted, and he said, you know what? Can't outcount God. You know what? He's probably a whole lot bigger than what I'm giving him credit for. And I believe him. Some of the easiest responses that we can have when we don't know what to do is to just remind ourselves God is who He says He is, and He can do what He says He can do. God, I find myself telling myself that often. God, you are who you say you are, and you can do what you say you can do. That's it. End of story. That answers all arguments. That calms all anxiety. That brings all peace. God, you are who you say you are, and you can do. That is why reading the Bible, I didn't even drink that. Anybody catch that? I got it. I took the lid off, and then I contemplated, and I thought, I think I got a little route to go here. I got to quit worshiping so much. You guys got to quit doing such a great job. That is why reading the Bible is so critically important to your faith, because the more you're reading the Bible, the more you're understanding what God has done and what He is capable of doing, and the more you have the Word of God flowing in your life, the more you are reminding yourself God is who He says He is, and God can do what He says He can do. I literally just read this verse and I thought, man, God, you are who you say you are, and you can do what you say you can do. And developing that discipline is not only feeding your spirit, it is reminding you what God is capable of and what He can do in your life. And then I love this part. So it comes time, Abraham says, okay, I believe you, but how are you going to show me? How am I going to see it? And look at what God calls him to do. Genesis 15:7-11 says, then the Lord told him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession. But Abraham replied, O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure I will actually possess it? Okay, I believe you, but now how do I know? Verse 9, The Lord told him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So Abraham presented all these to him and killed them. Then he cut each animal down the middle and laid the halves on side by side. He did not, however, cut the birds in half. Some vultures swooped down to eat the carcasses, but Abraham chased them away. Do you see what the Lord did? Abraham said, how will I know? And the Lord said, sacrifice. How will I know? Sacrifice. Go and gather these things and offer a sacrifice to me. You know, to experience what we want to experience, sometimes, most of the time, almost all of the time, there is a sacrifice involved. You know, who in here remembers buying their first car? Any 3 of you? Great, awesome. I remember buying my first car. I was umpiring baseball games. I was a lifeguard at the local pool. I was mowing lawns. I was doing everything I could to just make enough money to save up $500 to buy my granddad's 1985 Oldsmobile Cutlass. Smelled like cigars. He smoked cigars. He's a Catholic guy, and he had the old rosary, prayer right there, and all this stuff. I don't even know what it is, but it was all right there. It was just this kind of old gangster car. It was just my grandpa's old, long, big, looked like a tank, 1985 Oldsmobile Cutlass, and I remember driving it around. I thought it was so cool. I pulled up to my friend's driveway, and I was like honking the horn. I was like, check out the Cutlass, and they all piled into it, and the thing's riding this far from the ground, and we're just cruising the town of Spring Hill, Kansas. So cool. I got my first car, and then something happened. It was like revelation happened. I'm driving, and then all of a sudden, I hear a ding, and I look at my dash, and there's this orange dot, and it's right next to this E, which has a lever laying on top of it. And I was like, huh? Like, what is, I think I need gas. So I remember I pulled into Casey's General Store, got my wallet out, and I had $4 and some change in my wallet. I was like, dang. Wonder how much gas is. It says, it was 97 cents, by the way, when I filled up. I was like, it says 97 on the sign. So I went inside and I laid down the $4, and then I kept the change and bought some Big League Chew. And I was like, hey, this is what I got. Can I get some gas? And the guy kind of chuckled. He was like, yeah, go ahead. So I filled up gas, fired up the car, and I barely got home before it went bing again, and it hit E again. And I thought, you know what? There is some sacrifice involved in enjoying what I want to enjoy. I want to drive around. I want to drive to my job. I want to drive to my friend's house. But it's not just driving. There is a sacrifice. There is something that I have to do. You want to dig a little deeper here? Do we have some time? Can we? Let's jump in. Come on, give me something. You want to talk about sacrifice? Thank you, 3. Here, let's jump into this real quick, because I think this is important to understand. Let's learn the Bible real quick. First of all, Abraham gets this promise 24 years later. He has Isaac. Okay, he waited 24 years to experience what God promised him to. And then immediately afterwards, what does God ask Abraham to do? Sacrifice. Now take your boy that you love so much and put him on the altar. Here's what I think's happened. I think the word sacrifice in the American language and our culture has gotten a very negative connotation. Man, if I'm sacrificing, I'm not eating filet mignon, I'm eating bologna sandwiches. If I'm sacrificing, I'm not driving a new pickup, I'm driving Granddad's Cutlass. If I'm sacrificing, I'm riding a bicycle and I don't have a car. If I'm sacrificing, I'm giving up what I really want to satisfy myself with something that is far inadequate to my desires. That is what we perceive sacrifice to be when the word is mentioned. Here is what we have to understand. Sacrifice in the Bible is a beautiful, beautiful thing. It was glorious. There was a time before Christ that we're talking about now, the only way to connect with God was to make a sacrifice. The only way you shared intimacy with God was to take an animal, go to an altar inside of a temple, and offer it to God. Now, Jesus comes, and Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice for us, yet Romans 12:1 says Dear brothers, I urge you from the Apostle Paul to present your bodies, yourself, as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is true worship. So God still calls for sacrifice, and sacrifice is still beautiful to God. It's just a matter of we don't go find an animal and make a sacrifice. We give sacrifice from ourselves. And understand this, sacrifice is not giving up something for God. It is gaining intimacy with God. When we sacrifice so that we can give something up, if we sacrifice something because of our faith, we're not giving something up for God, we are gaining intimacy with God. So you've made some sacrifices in your career because you weren't willing to compromise your Christian faith. You weren't giving up a promotion for God, you were gaining intimacy with God. You weren't willing to do a few things because it would compromise your marriage or it would put your marriage in jeopardy, so you resisted those friends or you separated yourself from those people. You weren't giving up friends, you were gaining intimacy with God. For you college kids, when all of your friends are out partying and out sleeping together and going crazy, and you're at 10 p.m. at night in your dorm room watching Netflix by yourself, you're not sacrificing your social life. You are gaining intimacy with God. And He sees that sacrifice, and it is faithfulness on your behalf. Don't miss this. Embracing sacrifice is embracing intimacy with God. You are not giving up and losing. You are gaining and profiting with God. God calls Abraham over and over. You want to experience the promise? Go sacrifice. 24 years later, you have the promise. Now go sacrifice. God gives us Jesus as a sacrifice. And then in Romans 12:1, calls us to live as a sacrifice. Sacrificing is a beautiful thing. If you have sacrificed something for your faith, hold your head up high. You haven't given up. You have gained. You have received something greater. And then we see with Abraham, we'll finish here. I love how this whole thing ends with him. Genesis 15:12-15, it says, as the sun was going down, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a terrifying darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to Abraham, you can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. Verse 14, but I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end they will come away with great wealth. Verse 15, as for you, you will die in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. He gives him a vision of the fulfillment that he will experience. From this point on, Abraham's pursuit of the promise he was given, Genesis 12:1-3, is pure faithfulness. He doesn't question it again. He doesn't wonder again. He doesn't jeopardize it again. He is purely obedient because he caught the vision of what God was going to do. And then Genesis 25:5, I love the fulfillment. Abraham gave everything he owned to his son Isaac. It happened. He saw it years and years and years before. He sacrificed to experience it, and then he finally walked in the fulfillment of it. Anybody in here daddy of a daughter? Daddy of daughters? Let me see. Man, I'm a daddy of a daughter. And people who aren't, they don't understand us. Like my daughter, she is my baby. She is my little girl. I love her to the moon and back. I tell my family all the time she's my favorite. I'm like, I could lie to you for years and years and years, or I could just tell you all, this is my favorite. Like, this is my little girl, and she's all of our favorite. We all love her to death. We always say that at our house that Zion's our favorite. But my little girl, she is just, there's something about a daddy-daughter connection that is just, it's indescribable. And so nothing makes me happier than giving my little girl what she wants. She's such a pure, innocent, sweethearted girl. And my little girl, from the time she was born, was crazy about horses. It was one of her first words. If not her first word, it kind of shocked us. She was just like, horse. I was like, Daddy? Daddy? Daddy, horse. I go like, whoa, okay, well, we know where her passions lie. This kid at 6 months old, before she could talk, was in a pack and play in front of the TV as ESPN was playing the Kentucky Derby, and she's watching the horses run around there. She's just, when I say this child is crazy about horses. We have horse puzzles, we have horse shirts, horse pajamas, horse hats, we have horse toys, horse dolls, horse everything. We couldn't drive through the woodlands for the longest time because there are horses, security on horses and police on horses, and she would see them and she would be banging on the window and horse, horse, horse. She just loved horses. But before all of this had happened, at 2 years old, we did something. We loaded up our car and we drove her to Old MacDonald Farm. And up until this point, she had never seen a horse, but she was crazy about them. She would jump on my back and go, ee, it was just, horses were everything. And I'll never forget this. And I think do we have some pictures of her on a horse? Do we see those? Oh, this is her, okay? This is Zion at her horse lessons now. She will take that horse and lead it like a champ. She's in charge when she has that horse. Do we have another one? I think we have some more. Oh, yes, there's her at her riding lessons now. She's incredible on a horse. This is 3 years old. She'll trot by herself, and then she just loves on the horses. She'll hug the horse. Come on, go down for it, baby. There it is. And that is her. She's crazy about them. But before this was one of the coolest things I'd ever seen. We get to Old MacDonald Farm, and she gets out of the car, and we pay the admission, and I'm walking her, and she has no idea what is coming. And we get up to this field, and across the field, she sees for the first time a horse. And it was like there was an intensity in her walk, and there was a truth in her vision where she walked straight up to those stables, walked straight past the line, right into the stable, reached up and touched this horse. And it was more than amazement. It was more than awe. It was literally the fulfillment of what she knew was real in her mind, of what it was going to be like, of what she had practiced so many times, what she had seen and played with so many times, but had yet to experience it. It was the fulfillment of everything that she knew was coming her way. That's how you pursue a promise from God. You see it in your mind, and you know it is coming, and you believe for it, and you pursue it, and you don't get tunnel vision in your lack, and you embrace the sacrifices that you have to make, and you continue moving forward to it until one day you will see with your eyes what you've believed in your heart, that He who has promised you is faithful and true.